This is the revised, actually it's the new first chapter for the Valkyrie Protocol, so those of you who are on the first readers list won't have seen this yet. Chapter 1, Schloss von Schroeder, Siskov, January 2980 CE. It was a small chapel. It was also warm, despite the snow the ice-fanged wind drove against the ancient rose window above its altar. It had been lovingly maintained for over 1,500 years, and it had been provided with proper heating and air conditioning 6 centuries before this cold and snowy night. Despite that, the sense of its age filled the participants' nostrils with a subliminal scent of dust, of leather bindings and printer's ink. Not because there was any dust, but because there ought to have been. Because that many endless years were a palpable presence peopled by all the other human beings who had passed through this chapel. A lot of those people had been named Schroeder. The Schloss's current owner was not named Schroeder, but the title of Gräfin von Schroeder had passed to her through a matrilineal cadet line when the last Schroeder to hold it died without issue in 2653. The direct Schroeder line had ceased to exist, but the current Gräfin had been only too willing to offer the chapel's use tonight. Klaus Wilhelm von Schroeder stood just outside the sanctuary's rail. He looked a bit odd in the chapel's setting, and not simply because it had been built so many centuries before. He was clad in the formal white tie of 1,000 years in the past, which was enormously anachronistic in itself. But it seemed even more so in his case because no one in the 30th century had ever seen him in it. His normal, invariable, attire was a perfectly tailored uniform in what had once been called field grau, with the golden eye and bared sword shoulder patch of Cispal's Gordian division and a vice commissioner's insignia. Seeing him in anything else was a bit like catching God in his bathrobe, Benjamin Schroeder thought. On the other hand, he admitted, that patriarchal simile might have occurred to him because Klaus Wilhelm von Schroeder also happened to be his grandfather. And the other reason it's occurring to you is because you're both a hell of a long way from home, and you're just a teeny tiny bit nervous, he thought, which is stupid under the circumstances. Thanks to his neural implants, Benjamin could check the time, again, without anyone else's knowledge. That meant he could at least avoid looking like the proverbial nervous groom. You and Elzbieta have been living together for months, and nobody in the entire universe, hell, in the entire multiverse, gives a damn, he reminded himself. In fact, the only people this wedding really matters to are the two of you, and, well, the granddad too, I suppose. He has dropped that living in sin thing on you more than once. Surprising how straight-laced he can be sometimes, even after all this time. But it's not like he drew a gun on you to get you here. And worrying about it now that you are here is, well, it's a perfect illustration of why no one who really knows you ever said you weren't capable of being stupid. It's not like being dissolved into goo by weaponized nanotech, after all. He knew it wasn't, because he'd tried that, too, being dissolved into goo. Or at least one iteration of him had, and that other iteration's entire memory, including the highly unpleasant one of how he had died, lived in the same brain, side by side with the remembered lifetime of the version of him that hadn't been dissolved. It was complicated. He snorted softly at the thought, and the tall, broad-shouldered, blond-haired man at his shoulder glanced at him with a raised eyebrow. Nothing, Raybert, Benjamin reassured him. Just a thought. So you are capable of rational thought at the moment, Doc. Raybert Kaminsky, who did wear Gordian Division's uniform, grinned. Thank God! After dragging your butt here this morning, I'd started to wonder. I'm not that bad. On the contrary, Klaus Wilhelm said. You're worse than that, Benjamin. I am not! Ah, you remembered the ring, then? That's Raybert's job. He's the best man around here. Well, best synthoid anyway. That is so 20th century bio-based prejudice, Raybert observed. Just because you and Elzbieta refuse to give up your meat suits is no reason for you to be casting aspersions upon my own superbly engineered self. Benjamin made a rude sound, and his grandfather chuckled. Neither of them had ever met Raybert before his biological mind had been electronically stripped and his biological body had been rendered down for fertilizer or whatever else the System Cooperative Administration's reclamation systems had done with it. His current body had been hijacked from the admin's Department of Incarceration in Klaus Wilhelm's original universe after Kusaba Shigeki, General Director of the Department of Temporal Investigation, had decreed Raybert's biological destruction. And after his connectome's removal, the electronic recording of his personality and memories had been sentenced to life imprisonment in a virtual prison. In fairness to Shigeki, which none of the men in that chapel were prepared to be unless they had to, he had been fighting to prevent Raybert from destroying his entire universe. A reasonable person might concede that had given him at least some justification. And he'd actually shown leniency in many ways. The admin's laws about AIs and nanotech were draconian. Its entire government had come into existence in reaction to a horrific accident in which a rogue AI had left literally billions dead, and its law code was designed to prevent anything like that from ever happening again. In pursuit of that objective, it was ruthless with violators, and Raybert, from an entirely different universe, had been in violation of dozens of its laws. That meant he could have been sentenced to a one-way domain, a virtual prison where prisoners were effectively immortal, but there were no wardens. Nothing to protect the inmates from the most horrific atrocities their fellow inmates could visit upon them. It was, in fact, a place which was literally worse than death. Not that a prisoner couldn't die there. They could, over and over and over again. Of course, Raybert wasn't exactly prepared to give Shigeki the benefit of any doubts. Nor had he known that the director was being merciful, by his own lights at least. All he'd known was that both his and the admin's universe were going to die if someone didn't fix it, and that Shigeki was determined that no one would. And, of course, that he'd been subjected to the ultimate violation when his connectome was forcibly stripped in a process that automatically destroyed his biological mind forever. Nor had he known that there were worse prisons to which he might have been sent. The one he'd been in was quite bad enough, so far as he was concerned, and he'd expected to stay in it for the rest of his life, until his integrated companion, Philosophus, had rampaged through the admin's infrastructure to break him out. In the process, Philo, who, unlike Raybert, had been born an electronic being, had uploaded him to one of the admin peacekeepers' synthoids. As a consequence, Raybert came equipped with quite a few military-style upgrades, and he'd decided to keep his present body once he'd managed to fight his way home to his own universe once more. Of course, he'd added a few additional upgrades to it, too. For one thing, the ridiculous firewalls the admin, better known as the fucking admin if Raybert was talking, insisted upon as part of its paranoia about artificial intelligence in general, had been deleted when his software was updated to link with the Consolidated System Government's Infonets. In the process, Raybert and Philo had made damn sure no admin back doors had been left behind. Look, I know you two are enjoying the chance to give me a hard time, Benjamin said now. But really, where the hell is Elzbieta? If the two of you had been willing to settle for a virtual wedding, like any sane, civilized being, that wouldn't be an issue, Raybert pointed out. But no, not you two. Had to be in the flesh, didn't it? You could have been married in Notre Dame or St. Peter's Basilica. Hell, you could have been married in Hagia Sophia, the original Hagia Sophia, if you hadn't insisted on this brick-and-mortar anachronism. And if we were both connectomes, we would have done just that, Benjamin shot back. But in case you noticed, we aren't. Yeah, Raybert grimaced, but he let it drop as well. Probably, Benjamin thought, because he knew as well as Benjamin did that the real reason Benjamin and Elzbieta had chosen this venue was to honor Klaus Wilhelm. God only knew how many Schroeders had been married in this chapel over the endless, dusty years, but Klaus Wilhelm was among them. He and his first wife had been married on this very stone floor. Well, Benjamin reminded himself, not on this stone floor, actually. The chapel in which Klaus Wilhelm had been married no longer existed. For that matter, his entire universe no longer existed. He and Elżbieta Abramowski were, in fact, the sole survivors of that dead universe, and Benjamin, or the version of him that had died there, had helped to murder it. There'd been no choice. That iteration of the admin's universe had never been supposed to exist. It had been created out of the chaos of the Gordian knot, which had twisted 16 universes together into a lethal cluster, a seething mass of temporal energy which would have destroyed them all if it had not been undone. And so they had unknotted them, and the price had been Klaus Wilhelm and Elżbieta's own universe, and the life of the Benjamin Schroeder who had been born of it. 15 out of the 16 universes entangled in the knot survived because of that terrible sacrifice. A 94% survival rate was pretty damn good, Benjamin told himself again. He told himself that a lot when the ghosts of that vanished universe invaded his dreams. And it was true. He knew it was true, but somehow that didn't help on the bad nights. What helped on those nights was Elżbieta. Speaking of whom, I'm going to calm her, he announced. I'm starting to get genuinely worried. She's the most compulsively, I'd almost say psychotically, except that she found out I had and hurt me, punctual person I know. It's not like her to be running late, especially on a day like this. Don't you dare, Raybert said, poking him in the chest with a large and very strong finger. Benjamin Schroeder was a tall, broad-shouldered man himself, almost as tall and broad-shouldered as his grandfather, but that poke was enough to put him back on his heels. He rubbed his chest, glaring at Raybert, and the synthoid shook his head. Doc, I know you're a really smart guy, so I'm wondering why it hasn't occurred to you that Elżbieta wouldn't be running late by accident, or rather that she would already have calmed you if things weren't going according to plan.